I remember the first time I decided to hike the remote sections of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I wasn't inexperienced, I had been backpacking for years, but there was a sense of finality about this trip, like I needed to disappear for a few days to be completely alone in the wilderness. It was early September, the air crisp in the mornings and still warm in the afternoons. I parked my old pickup at a small trailhead near a logging road that barely showed on any map, double-checked my pack, and started hiking before dawn. The trail at first was forgiving, winding through dense groves of pine and maple. Morning sunlight poured through the trees, turning the dew on the needles into a glittering carpet of light. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the quiet hum of nature, the occasional bird, the creek that gurgled along the side of the path. By late morning, I had reached a small clearing and decided to stop for water and a snack. I sat on a fallen log, drinking from my bottle, feeling the sun warm my back, and listening to the subtle sounds of the forest. It felt perfect, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. By the second day, I had ventured further than I originally planned, following a narrow side trail that split off from the main path. It was less maintained, overgrown in parts, and faint in others, but I trusted my map and compass. Around midday, I reached a small stream that was too steep and rocky to cross easily. While trying to find a shallow section, I caught a glimpse of movement across the water, a shadow that darted behind the trees. I froze, scanning the opposite bank, but there was nothing. Just forest. Still, a shiver ran down my spine. I set up camp in a small grove of pines near the stream, thinking the water nearby would make life easier. I made a small fire, cooked my dinner, and watched as dusk crept into the sky. That night, the forest seemed different, too still. The usual sounds of insects, distant animals, and rustling leaves were absent. Even the wind had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the forest settling into night, but a gnawing unease settled in my stomach. Hours later, I woke to a soft, deliberate snapping of twigs outside my tent. My pulse jumped. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, but the trees stood still. I listened, holding my breath. Crunch, crunch, pause, then silence. My imagination, I told myself, a deer, maybe, but the pattern was deliberate, almost human. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard footsteps circling my tent. At some point, I swear I heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, hissing, almost melodic, like someone was speaking directly into my mind. Dawn came, and with it, relief. I unzipped the tent and froze. Barefoot footprints circled my campsite, uneven, wide, human-shaped. My stomach knotted. I didn't see anyone. I packed quickly, avoiding breakfast, my hands trembling as I shoved gear into my pack. I had to get back to the main trail, had to get out of there. The forest didn't cooperate. Landmarks I remembered from my hike the day before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and rocks. The compass pointed north, but north didn't look like anything I recognized. Panic set in as I walked, the sweat pouring down my back, the backpack digging into my shoulders. By the third day, I had wandered far from any trail. The sun rose and fell without marking any sense of distance traveled. I was low on water, fatigued, and starting to question my sanity. That's when I noticed the smell, a cloying, metallic scent, like something rotting. At first, I tried to ignore it. Animal carcass, I thought. But it lingered, stronger with every step, and it wasn't just the smell, it felt like it was pressing in on me, heavy, suffocating. Then I saw it, a clearing with a structure in the middle. It wasn't natural. Branches were tied together with strips of cloth, animal bones embedded into it. Skulls stared outward, empty sockets, hollow and accusing. I stopped, heart hammering. My first instinct was to run, but I was rooted to the spot, trapped by some primal fear. Then I heard the whisper again. Closer this time, clearer. "You don't belong," it hissed. I spun, shining my flashlight, but the clearing was empty. The forest held its breath. I ran, breaking through underbrush, tripping over roots, branches tearing at my clothes. The whispering followed, circling me, wrapping around my name like smoke. Night came before I knew it. I stumbled into another hollow and forced a fire, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Every shadow seemed alive. Every rustle felt deliberate. I didn't sleep. Not really. I stayed awake, listening, trying to convince myself it was the forest, nothing more. By the fourth day, I was a shadow of myself. My water was nearly gone, my food rationed to a single protein bar. Every step became agony. The forest was a labyrinth, shifting, impossible to read. That's when I saw movement. A figure, impossibly tall, thin, moving with a fluidity that didn't belong to humans or animals. It stopped when it saw me, tilting its head unnaturally. I ran, faster than I'd ever run, branches lashing at my face, my pack bouncing against my spine. The whispering followed. You can't leave. You don't belong. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsed into a stream bed, face down in mud, gasping, choking. My mind screamed at me to keep going, to survive. I crawled, bleeding and bruised, for what felt like hours, until I stumbled onto a faint trail marker I recognized. By the fifth day, I had found my way to the main trail, exhausted and delirious. I reached a logging road near the edge of the wilderness and collapsed beside my truck. Other hikers found me shortly after, helping me into their vehicle. I couldn't explain everything, the footprints, the whispering, the figure, but I knew it had been real. Something in those woods had followed me, had watched me, and I had escaped by the smallest measure of luck. Even now, weeks later, I feel it. In the corner of my vision, shadows bend unnaturally. At night, I hear whispers through the dark. Sometimes I see a tall figure at the edge of the forest in dreams, waiting. I will never return. The woods still call to me, though, still remember me. Story the end. The morning air was crisp, almost painfully cold for early September, and the smell of wet earth and pine sap was sharp as Matt adjusted the straps on his pack. He had insisted on one last trip into the wilderness before returning to the suffocating predictability of his office job in Denver, and his friends Karen and Luis had eagerly agreed. The plan was simple, a 3-day backpacking trip into the Wyoming backcountry, miles from roads, cell service, and human interference. Matt loved the idea of complete isolation, though as they climbed the first ridge, he couldn't help but feel a small, gnawing sense of unease, a tightness in his chest he tried to dismiss as nerves. They followed a faint trail, the kind that only the most experienced hikers would recognize as passable, weaving through dense stands of lodgepole pine. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in sharp beams, illuminating patches of moss and the occasional fallen log slick with rain from the night before. Matt led, Karen in the middle, and Luis at the rear, checking maps and occasionally glancing behind, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Every so often, a bird would call, a woodpecker drumming somewhere deep in the forest, but otherwise the air was unnervingly still. By mid-afternoon, they found a small clearing near the edge of a creek. The sound of rushing water was comforting, almost meditative, and the three of them set about making camp. Luis insisted on taking the first watch. Karen unpacked the cooking gear, and Matt wandered along the creek, scanning the trees and listening to the faint rustling of branches. Every so often, the forest seemed to hum, a low vibration beneath the surface of sound, almost like a pulse. Matt shook his head, dismissing the thought, telling himself the solitude was playing tricks on him. Night fell quickly, a shadow swallowing the forest whole. They sat around a small fire, the flames dancing in the darkness and casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. The cold seeped into their bones despite the warmth of the fire, and they huddled close, eating canned jerky. Stories were told, mostly about strange sightings or local legends, but Matt felt his unease grow with each passing minute. The wind rustled the treetops, carrying faint whispers, almost human in nature, and he couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were upon them, just beyond the firelight. After a tense evening, they decided to turn in. Luis volunteered for the first watch again, disappearing into the darkness with a flashlight and a sense of purpose that made Matt jealous. He and Karen climbed into their tent, listening to the forest. Every small sound seemed exaggerated, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a small animal, even the distant howl of what could have been a wolf. Sleep eventually overtook him, though dreams offered no comfort. He dreamt of shadowy figures moving among the trees, whispering their names, beckoning him deeper into the woods. When Matt woke, the sun had just started to rise, its pale light diffused through the morning mist. Luis was nowhere to be seen. The tent flap was open, the cool morning breeze fluttering through. Matt shook Karen awake, and together they scanned the clearing. There was no sign of their friend, no footprints leading away, nothing. A tight knot formed in Matt's stomach. Maybe he went to fetch water? Karen suggested, voice uncertain. but Matt shook his head. Luis had all of his gear. He wouldn't have left without it. Panic began to seep into their veins. They began searching the surrounding forest, calling Luis's name. Hours passed with no response, the forest remaining stubbornly silent except for the creek's constant babble. And then, near a stand of thick pines, they noticed footprints. Large, elongated, and oddly spaced. They didn't match Luis's boots, and there was an unnatural spacing between some of them, as if whoever or whatever made them could stride unnaturally long distances. Fear twisted in Matt's gut, but he forced himself forward. They followed the trail, winding through denser underbrush, the trees closing around them as though guiding them deeper into the wilderness. Shadows shifted in ways that didn't make sense, and the whispering seemed to intensify, sometimes behind them, sometimes just ahead. At one point, Matt could swear he saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin, impossibly still. He froze, heart hammering, and when he raised his flashlight, it vanished. Hours later, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow valley. From above, the terrain appeared empty, but a flash of white among the rocks caught Matt's eye. He squinted, convinced it was Lewis. He ran down the slope, Karen close behind, calling his name. The figure darted between boulders with an unnatural speed, disappearing and reappearing as if the rocks themselves were concealing it. They followed as best they could, slipping on loose stone and tearing their hands on jagged surfaces, until they came upon a small, flat area. The footprints ended there. Luis was gone. A chill wind swept through the valley, carrying with it faint, high-pitched laughter like children playing just out of reach. Matt pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to steady his breathing. Karen's hands trembled, and she whispered that they should turn back, but Matt knew there was no clear path. The valley seemed endless, every direction leading to impenetrable brush or jagged cliffs. The whispering grew louder, sometimes overlapping, as if multiple voices were calling from all around. They stumbled upon a creek, shallow and fast-moving, and decided to follow it downstream, hoping it would lead to a trail or road. Hours of struggling through underbrush, wading through water, and clambering over rocks passed. Exhaustion and fear warped their sense of time. Finally, they saw a faint glimmer of light through the trees. Cautiously, they approached and discovered an old abandoned cabin, half hidden by overgrowth. The door was off its hinges, the windows broken, and the air was thick with dust and decay. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, animal bones, and, disturbingly, small fragments of human bones. Matt gagged and covered his mouth, eyes darting to the shadows. Karen's camera fell from her hands, and she whispered that they shouldn't stay. The sound of something moving outside made their hearts pound. Scratching at the door, a soft, deliberate sound, followed by faint whispering, beckoning them. Matt gripped a splintered piece of wood like a weapon, though they both knew it wouldn't do much against whatever prowled outside. Night fell again, and they barricaded themselves inside as best they could. Outside, the forest seemed to come alive, shifting shadows moving between the trees, the whispers growing into distinct voices, calling their names. Sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan of the cabin made Matt's heart leap. He felt the oppressive weight of the forest pressing against the thin walls, a tangible presence that seemed to watch and anticipate every move. As dawn broke, they ventured out cautiously. The cabin was gone. Vanished as though it had never existed. The creek flowed where it had before, but there was no trace of the strange symbols, the footprints, or the bones. Exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified, they followed the creek further, desperate for signs of civilization. Hours later, the distant hum of an engine reached their ears. Relief surged as a ranger truck appeared, and they stumbled into the clearing, waving and calling out. The ranger, an older man with wary eyes, helped them into the truck and listened to their story. He didn't ask about the footprints or the cabin. He only warned them about the dangers of the backcountry and how easy it was to get lost. Search parties later scoured the area but found no trace of Luis, no footprints, and no signs of the cabin. Matt and Karen never returned to the wilderness. Even years later, Matt would awake in the middle of the night, convinced he could hear the whispers again, the sound of children laughing or footsteps pacing just beyond his bedroom door. The memory of the endless trees, the unnatural shadows, and the oppressive feeling of being watched haunted him, Somewhere in the vast Wyoming wilderness, Luis remained lost, and whatever had claimed him, and the forest itself, waited, patient and hungry, for the next trespassers. The fear and trauma never fully left them. They warned others, but most dismissed their story as a cautionary tale or an overactive imagination. Yet Matt knew the truth. The forest was alive in ways no one could understand. It had a memory, a hunger, and a way of taking those who wandered too far from the safety of roads and trails. And in the darkest corners of the night, he sometimes swore he could hear the voices again, calling him back, beckoning him to follow the creek into the endless, shadowed wilderness, where the trees whispered and waited. He would never step foot into that wilderness again, but the memory was etched into him as vivid and haunting as if it had happened yesterday. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees, every whisper of wind could be a reminder that the forest still watched, still remembered, and still waited. And somewhere, deep within the endless pines and rocky creeks, Luis remained, a permanent resident of that living, malevolent wilderness, a warning to all who dared enter. Even with the passage of time, Matt and Karen could not escape the mental echo of that wilderness. Nightmares returned without warning, dreams filled with whispers, shifting shadows, and glimpses of figures that moved too quickly to be human. The more they tried to suppress the memories, the more persistent they became, as though the forest itself had imprinted on their minds. In quieter moments, Matt would find himself staring at the woods behind his home in Denver, imagining the vast expanse of trees, the hidden creeks, and the unseen eyes that might still be watching, waiting for someone else foolish enough to wander into its domain. Karen, too, struggled with the memory. She avoided hiking, camping, or even watching wilderness documentaries. The simple rustle of leaves in the wind or the creak of branches at night would send her into a panic. Friends and family offered reassurances, claiming she was overreacting, but she knew better. They had experienced something unexplainable, something that defied logic and reason. The forest had marked them, even if its presence had receded to the distant mountains of Wyoming. In the months that followed, reports surfaced of hikers disappearing in the same region, people vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic footprints and abandoned gear. Matt and Karen followed the news obsessively, a combination of fear and morbid curiosity gripping them. Each new report reinforced the haunting certainty that the forest was alive, a predator camouflaged as wilderness, patient and eternal, claiming those who strayed too far. Despite their terror, a small part of Matt felt an obsessive compulsion to understand it, to map the invisible lines that the forest seemed to obey, to predict its movements and its choice of victims. He pored over topographic maps, read every account of missing hikers, and tried to reconcile the experiences with rational thought. But no amount of research provided answers. The footprints, the cabin, the whispers, all remained unexplained. Even when surrounded by the safety of city life, the memory of that wilderness lingered. Every night as he lay in bed, Matt would sometimes hear faint, distant laughter or the whispering of voices calling his name. Shadows would flit across the walls of his apartment, or he would catch a movement in the corner of his eye that seemed almost deliberate. The fear was always there, a constant companion, a reminder that the forest, though distant, had not forgotten him, had not released its hold. And somewhere in the depths of the Wyoming wilderness, the trees waited. They grew taller, denser, and darker, each one a sentinel of the forest's secrets. The creek continued to run, unchanged and oblivious to human passage, and Luis, or what had become of him, remained lost within the shadowed pines, a permanent resident of the forest's malevolent domain. The forest was patient. It remembered. And it would continue to claim those who dared to enter, just as it had claimed Luis and threatened to claim anyone who wandered too far from the safety of roads and civilization. Matt and Karen could only live with the memory, haunted by what they had seen and by what they knew waited silently somewhere deep in the uncharted wilderness. Story: the end. It started as a weekend getaway for 5 friends, Matt, Josh, Kara, Emily, and Dave, who were all looking to escape the suffocating routine of city life in Chicago. They had decided on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a place they had all seen in pictures, but none had truly explored. The plan was simple: hike into the woods, set up camp near Lake Superior, fish, explore, and enjoy the wilderness without any interference from technology or schedules. None of them were particularly seasoned outdoorsmen, but they were confident. They had backpacks, tents, a couple of GPS devices, and enough food and water to last 3 days. They arrived at the trailhead late Friday morning, the sun casting pale light across the dense canopy of pines and maples. The air smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and the faint tang of the lake in the distance. Dave, who was driving, parked the SUV on a dirt path that seemed to disappear into the woods. He joked about whether the vehicle would survive the journey back, but everyone laughed and shrugged it off. As they began the hike, the path was narrow and winding, flanked by thick underbrush. Birds called overhead, and the distant roar of the lake could occasionally be heard through the trees. The group settled into an easy rhythm, joking and teasing each other as they carried their packs, unaware of the way the forest seemed to grow heavier with every step. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing near a small rocky outcrop overlooking a hidden cove of the lake. The sight was breathtaking, jagged rocks plunging into deep blue water, sunlight glinting off the ripples. They set up camp quickly, pitching tents and collecting dry wood for a fire. The generator they had brought proved more useful than expected, buzzing quietly as it powered a couple of lanterns. That first night passed uneventfully. They ate hot dogs over the fire, roasted marshmallows, and drank canned beer, the stars reflecting on the surface of the lake. The forest was alive with sound, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional splash in the water that they attributed to fish. But as they settled into their tents later, a feeling of unease crept in, subtle at first, and then undeniable. It was Kara who noticed it first. She was lying on her back, staring at the moonlight filtering through the tent fabric when she heard it. A low, rhythmic snapping, like twigs breaking under careful but heavy footsteps. At first, she thought it was Josh or Dave playing a prank, but when she called out, there was no response. The sound continued intermittently, circling the camp in a way that made her stomach churn. The next morning, Josh suggested a hike along the lake's edge. They packed light, carrying only water, snacks, and fishing gear. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, forcing them to step carefully over roots and rocks. The further they went, the quieter the forest became, and a strange fog began to rise from the lake, curling around the trees like a living thing. Hours into the hike, Emily stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others froze. A faint rustling had come from the underbrush, deliberate and measured. It was too heavy to be a rabbit, too quiet to be a deer. None of them could identify it, but the sound felt aware of them, tracking their movements. Matt laughed nervously. "Probably a raccoon or something. Don't let it freak you out." But even as he spoke, his voice carried a tension that betrayed his unease. They continued, trying to ignore the sound, but it followed them. Every time they paused, it paused. Every time they moved, it moved. The trail eventually led to a small waterfall hidden in a secluded glen. The sight was enchanting, with water tumbling over moss-covered rocks into a clear pool. They set down their packs to rest, taking photos and skipping stones. But as they relaxed, Kara noticed the prints in the mud near the water's edge. "They're huge," she said quietly. The others gathered to look. The footprints were irregular, large, and unlike any animal they could identify. Matt frowned. "Could be a bear?" Dave shook his head. "Bears don't walk like this. Look at the spacing and the shape. Whatever made these is tall, really tall." They debated briefly, but chose to move on, though the unease lingered. By the time they returned to camp, the forest seemed darker, the air heavier. That night, the snapping sounds returned, accompanied by low guttural growls. The group tried to stay calm, but tension built with every hour. Shadows flitted just outside the firelight, always at the edges of vision. By the third day, the situation had escalated. They decided to hike inland, away from the lake, hoping to find another trail that would lead back to the main road. The forest grew denser, and the paths less distinct. Every tree seemed the same, every bend in the trail looking familiar, as if they were walking in circles. The snapping and growling sounds continued, growing louder, closer, more deliberate. Dave's GPS device began malfunctioning, flickering and then dying completely. Josh's phone had no signal. Panic began to set in. "We need to turn back," Matt said, voice tight. But the forest seemed to conspire against them. Every direction they chose led them deeper into the woods. Trails disappeared, trees seemed to shift, and the sense of being watched intensified. Night fell as they stumbled upon an old cabin, hidden among the pines. It looked abandoned, the wood rotting and windows caked with grime. They had no choice but to take shelter there. Inside, the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the smell of decay. Floorboards groaned under their weight, and strange scratches covered the walls. Kara shivered. What is this? They barricaded the door with broken furniture. Hours passed, but sleep was impossible. The forest outside was alive with sounds, scratching, growls, and footsteps on the roof. Emily swore she saw shapes moving beyond the windows, their faces pressed to the glass. By midnight, the terror had consumed them. At some point, a shadow entered the cabin. They didn't see it fully. Only glimpses, tall, thin limbs, an unnaturally angled head, glowing eyes. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling them, pressing into their minds with a presence that felt like ice and despair. Hours blurred into minutes, minutes into hours. Their screams were swallowed by the forest. When dawn finally came, the shadow was gone. The cabin was empty. The forest was quiet, unnervingly so. They stumbled outside, disoriented and hollowed, only to find the jeep waiting where they had parked it, as if it had never been moved. Trembling, they climbed in and drove away, not speaking until they reached the highway. Back in civilization, the group was fractured. Friends and family noticed long silences, vacant stares, nightmares that left them screaming. None of them ever returned to the Upper Peninsula. They would later hear stories of hikers vanishing in the same area, of growls in the night, of shadows moving against the wind. And though they never spoke of the details, each of them knew the truth. The wilderness remembered, and it had eyes that never blinked. Even years later, Matt would wake screaming from dreams of snapping branches and glowing eyes. Kara would see shapes in the corner of her vision at night. Josh could hear whispers in the wind that chilled him to the bone. And Dave and Emily would lie awake, wondering if one day the forest might call again, claiming what it had once let go. The wilderness had tested them, hunted them, and let them leave. But it never forgot. Story the end. It was early September when Matt, his childhood friend Derek, and Derek's girlfriend Lisa set out for the remote forests of northern Minnesota. The idea had come to Matt during a particularly stressful week at his job in Minneapolis. He longed for the kind of solitude that only the dense, untouched woods could offer. Derek had grown up camping but hadn't been out in years, and Lisa, an amateur photographer, wanted to capture the autumn colors before the first snowfall. They packed enough supplies for 5 days: tents, food, water, extra layers, and an old compass that Matt insisted he could navigate with. But what none of them anticipated was how unforgiving the wilderness could be when it wanted to be. The first day was deceptively perfect. They drove up the long gravel roads that snaked through the forest, passing small lakes and abandoned cabins, finally parking at a trailhead that promised isolation and rugged terrain. The trail was narrow, flanked by pines and birches with leaves turning golden and red. Birds flitted overhead, and the air was crisp and pungent with pine and damp soil. Matt led confidently, having spent summers in the woods with his father, pointing out signs of wildlife and old logging paths. Lisa paused often, snapping photos of the sunlight streaking through the trees, while Derek, quieter than the others, kept checking his phone even though it had no signal. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing near a creek to set up their first camp. Matt inspected the area for hazards, noting that the ground was relatively flat and the trees offered some shelter from the wind. Derek wandered closer to the creek to examine footprints he noticed along the muddy bank. At first, they seemed like ordinary deer tracks, but a closer look revealed they were too large, elongated, and oddly shaped. "These aren't deer," Derek said quietly. "No animal I know leaves prints like this." Matt crouched down, brushing away leaves, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone passed through recently. Hunters, trappers, it's remote. Doesn't mean it's dangerous. But the tracks led into the forest and disappeared abruptly, as though whoever or whatever made them had vanished. Night fell fast, and the forest grew ominously quiet. They built a fire and tried to eat, but the atmosphere was heavy. Branches snapped in the distance at irregular intervals, and an occasional low growl echoed faintly through the trees. Lisa shivered, whispering that it sounded too coordinated to be an animal. Matt laughed nervously, insisting it was probably a coyote or a raccoon, but even he couldn't completely shake the feeling that they were being watched. Sleep came fitfully. Around midnight, Matt awoke to a scratching sound along the edge of their tent. He nudged Derek, who groaned and rolled over, half asleep. Lisa whispered, "Do you hear that?" The scratching continued, irregular and deliberate. Matt unzipped the tent flap, shining a flashlight outside. Nothing. Only darkness and the swaying silhouettes of the trees. He convinced himself it was just branches brushing together or a small animal, though his pulse raced in the dark. Morning brought a false sense of calm. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the forest looked serene. They packed quickly and aimed to hike further into the wilderness, hoping to reach a ridge and Matt remembered from previous trips. The trail narrowed as they went deeper, and the forest began to feel oppressive. Moss draped over every tree trunk, some trees twisted in unnatural shapes, and shadows seemed to move at the edges of their vision. Occasionally, Lisa would stop, saying she felt watched, though she couldn't see anything. By the second day, unease had taken hold. They discovered more tracks, increasingly non-human, larger, clawed, and elongated. They crisscrossed the trail, some leading deeper into dense undergrowth. The further they went, the more difficult navigation became. Landmarks twisted unnaturally. Streams appeared to flow in impossible directions, and the sun, which should have been high in the sky, cast strange, angled shadows that made orientation nearly impossible. Around mid-afternoon, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned campsite, rusted cans scattered across the ground, a torn tent frame, and skeletal remains partially buried in moss and leaves. The smell of decay was overpowering. Lisa gagged, covering her nose, while Derek urged turning back immediately. Matt tried to rationalize it as old animal remains, but even he had to admit it looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. They set up camp nearby for the night, hearts pounding. Night was worse. The forest seemed alive, the shadows stretching unnaturally in the moonlight. Footsteps circled their camp, soft, dragging noises followed by low, guttural growls. Whispering voices floated through the trees, unintelligible but clearly directed at them. Matt shined a flashlight into the darkness, catching fleeting glimpses of movement, tall, hunched silhouettes that melted into the trees. At one point, a scream split the night, shrill and inhuman. Derek bolted upright, only to vanish into the darkness, leaving Matt and Lisa frozen in terror. Matt ran after Derek, calling his name, but the trail seemed to twist and double back, confusing every step. The forest closed in, branches whipping their faces, roots tripping them. Shadows moved at the periphery of vision, disappearing when confronted directly. Exhaustion and panic slowed them, and by sunrise, Matt found Lisa huddled against a tree, sobbing. Derek was gone, leaving behind only the clawed footprints, which led into a thicket of impossibly dense undergrowth. They stumbled upon an abandoned ranger hut purely by chance. Inside, dust covered the floor and old journals littered the space. One journal, decades old, described creatures in the northern forests, neither human nor animal, that stalked travelers, luring them off trails into the depths, sometimes never returning. The description matched exactly what they had seen. The hut, dilapidated and musty, became their only refuge. Over the next 2 days, they attempted to navigate back to civilization. Trails looped impossibly, streams misled them, and the sun's position seemed deceptive. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, could signal the creatures were nearby. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was impossible. Every night brought whispers, guttural growls, and glimpses of those tall, hunched figures with glowing eyes. Hunger, fatigue, and terror blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Finally, after days of desperation, they stumbled onto a logging road. Exhausted, disheveled, and terrified, they were picked up by a trucker who drove them back to the nearest town. They reported Derek missing, but despite search parties combing the forest, no trace was found. Locals whispered warnings about hikers vanishing in the northern woods, but the tales were dismissed as folklore. For Matt and Lisa, the experience was real and left lasting scars on their psyche. Years later, Matt still drives past the dense forests of northern Minnesota, and the memory remains vivid. He sometimes sees shadows at the tree line, taller and more hunched than any human. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he hears faint whispers carried by the wind. Lisa never ventures into the wilderness again. Both carry the memory of clawed footprints, guttural growls, and the unnatural presence in the forest. The northern woods, beautiful and serene by day, hold secrets older than anyone can imagine, waiting patiently for the next traveler who dares to venture too far. The forest, with its shifting trails, unnatural shadows, and entities that defy understanding, is a place that tests every assumption of reality. The wilderness is patient, ancient, and observant. Some who enter are forever changed. Some never return. For Matt and Lisa, the northern forests remain a living nightmare, a place where time and space twist and where the unknown waits silently, always watching, always patient. Even now, decades later, Matt can feel the eyes of the forest on him when he passes nearby. The memory of Derek lost, of clawed footprints pressed into moss, and the glowing, hunched figures haunt him endlessly. No one who hasn't walked those depths could understand the terror, the exhaustion, the sense of being hunted by something ancient and patient. The forest remembers. It waits. And sometimes when the wind shifts and the branches creak just so, it whispers, reminding those who survive that some places are never meant to be left alone. Story the end. The first mistake I made was underestimating the forest. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me and my gear for 4 days in the Bitterroot Mountains. I'd done smaller hikes before, a few weekend excursions into state parks, and one guided backpacking trip in Colorado. But this time I wanted solitude. I'd spent weeks studying the maps, memorizing the trail markers, planning my route down to the hour. I had every piece of equipment a man could need. A good compass, a satellite phone, a solid knife, enough food for a week, and a lightweight tent I could set up blindfolded. I wanted to prove to myself I could handle it. I left the trailhead on a Wednesday morning, the sky a clear, pale blue, the crisp air sharp with the smell of pine. The first few miles were perfect, the path winding through towering evergreens, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the quiet, God, the quiet, pressing against my ears like a comforting weight. I could hear the distant rush of the creek, the occasional snap of a branch under a deer's hooves. Everything felt alive, but calm. By the second afternoon, I was deep in the backcountry. No cell service, no sound of planes overhead, just miles of rugged terrain that swallowed the horizon. I set up camp on a narrow ridge with a view of the valley below, the sun sinking behind the peaks and setting the world on fire in hues of orange and gold. That night, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. But peace doesn't last. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. I was breaking camp when I noticed the footprints, bare footprints, just off the trail, maybe 30 feet from where I'd been sleeping. They weren't animal prints. The toes were long, the arch deep, pressed hard into the damp soil. Human, but not quite. The spacing between them was too far apart, like whoever made them had an unnaturally long stride. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker, someone passing through without boots for reasons I didn't need to understand. I tightened my pack straps and pushed forward, forcing the unease down into my stomach. By midday, the forest had started to change. The air felt thicker, heavier somehow, as though it clung to my skin. The trees grew closer together, branches arching overhead like twisted ribs, filtering the light so everything around me had a dim green cast. The sounds of the forest, the bird song, the rustle of small animals were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. I stopped for water near a narrow stream, crouching to fill my bottle, when I caught movement across the water. Just a flicker, a shadow between the trees, tall and still. I froze, my pulse thundering, and waited. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, I made camp in a small clearing, my fire crackling low, my tent zipped tight. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that my city-softened brain was just overreacting to the isolation. But sleep wouldn't come easy. Every time my eyes drifted closed, I heard it. Soft footsteps circling my campsite, just outside the light of the fire. Slow, deliberate, careful. I gripped my knife and sat upright for hours, listening to my own breath until dawn finally broke. On the third day, I lost the trail. I'd been following the markers, small red blazes painted on tree trunks every few hundred feet, but at some point they stopped. I backtracked, thinking I'd missed one, but the forest had shifted, unfamiliar and alien. Every tree looked the same. I tried my compass, but the needle twitched erratically, spinning and jerking in a way that made no sense. Panic nipped at the edge of my mind, but I shoved it down and picked a direction, marking the trunks with my knife as I went. My pace slowed as the day dragged on, the light fading fast. That was when I found the first cairn. It sat in the middle of a narrow animal path, a careful stack of stones about knee-high, balanced perfectly. I stared at it, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I'd seen cairns before, trail markers usually, but this one felt wrong. There were no other signs of a trail nearby, and the stones were smooth and rounded, not the jagged rocks scattered naturally across the ground. I stepped around it carefully and kept walking. By dusk, I'd passed at least a dozen more. Some were small, just 3 or 4 stones balanced delicately. Others were taller, some almost to my waist, arranged in strange spirals and lines that made no sense. They were everywhere, as though someone or something had been watching and waiting, leaving them for me to find. That night, I didn't make a fire. I sat in the dark, my back against my pack, knife in hand, listening. Around midnight, the footsteps came again, slow and steady, circling me just out of sight. Then a whisper, faint but sharp, like breath slipping through teeth. My name. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was trembling, exhausted, every muscle taut with fear. I wanted out. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care about my pride. I just wanted to be back at my truck, the safety of the highway, the hum of civilization in my ears. I started walking, faster now, pushing through the underbrush, not bothering to mark my path. The forest grew denser, darker, the canopy overhead blotting out the sky. My map was useless. My compass spun lazily, pointing nowhere. That was when I saw it. A shape between the trees, tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, its limbs long and thin, its head cocked slightly to one side like it was studying me. No face, not really, just the impression of where a face should have been. I froze, unable to move, unable to think. It didn't move. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it slipped back into the trees without a sound. I ran. Branches clawed at my arms, tore at my clothes, but I didn't stop. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept moving, driven by pure terror. By the time I collapsed near a narrow stream, gasping for air, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest had fallen into that suffocating silence again. I knew then that I wasn't going to make it out. Not by myself. That night, I built a small fire, despite the risk. I needed the light, the illusion of safety, something to hold back the dark pressing in from every direction. I sat there, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the trees, waiting for movement. The breathing started around midnight. Slow. Heavy. Too close. I gripped the knife so tight my knuckles ached, my eyes darting in every direction, but the forest was empty. Still, the breathing grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I turned, knife raised, and saw nothing. The fire sputtered and died, plunging me into blackness. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, waiting for the inevitable. Hours, maybe. When dawn finally came, gray light seeping through the branches, I was still alive, though I couldn't remember falling asleep. I forced myself to move, to keep going, though every step felt heavier than the last. My food was nearly gone, my water low. I stumbled through the underbrush, directionless, until I reached a clearing. In the center stood another cairn, this one taller than me, the stones slick with what looked like dark, dried blood. Carved into the dirt at its base in sharp, uneven letters was a single word: run. I did. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The forest blurred around me, indistinct shapes and shadows twisting in my vision. When my legs finally gave out, I collapsed face first in the dirt, sobbing, my body shaking. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on asphalt. The road was cracked and faded, the paint barely visible, but it was a road. A truck pulled over minutes later, the driver shouting as he jumped out, asking if I was hurt. I couldn't answer. I just sat there, trembling, staring at the tree line. The rangers told me I was lucky, said I'd been gone 5 days, wandering in circles less than 10 miles from the main trailhead. They chalked it up to exhaustion, dehydration, maybe even hallucinations, but I know what I saw, and sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the breathing. Slow, heavy, patient, waiting. Story the end. The air in the Bitterroot Mountains always carried that sharp, resinous bite of pine, the kind that clung to your clothes and hair long after you'd left the woods. I remember stepping out of the old Ford Ranger that morning, stretching stiff legs from the 7-hour drive from Boise, and thinking to myself that the silence here felt heavier than usual. My buddy Wes was already unstrapping the packs from the bed of the truck, his usual cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes scanning the thick wall of timber that stretched endlessly beyond the gravel turnout. "Think we'll make it to the lake before dark?" he asked, slinging his pack over one shoulder. "If we move fast," I said, checking my watch. "It's only about 6 miles in, shouldn't be a problem." That was the plan, anyway. 6 miles along an unmarked trail that a friend of a friend swore led to an untouched alpine lake, one of those secret spots fly fishermen kept to themselves. No signs, no trail markers, just a GPS pin on an old topo map Wes had downloaded. The kind of spot where you wouldn't see another soul for days. Exactly what we wanted. There were 4 of us. Me, Wes, his younger brother Dylan, and Jess, my girlfriend. Jess wasn't thrilled about the trip from the start. She liked the outdoors, but not the deep woods, as she put it. Still, she came along, maybe just to keep an eye on me and Wes, who had a habit of drinking too much whiskey around the fire. "Pack light," I told everyone before we left Boise. "We're just out for 3 nights. We'll hike in, set up camp, fish a little, hike out." It sounded simple then. The trail started wide and forgiving, crunching gravel under our boots, but quickly narrowed as the terrain swallowed us up. Pine trunks closed in, the sunlight dimmed, and the air cooled noticeably the deeper we went. Every so often, we'd pass an old blaze on a tree, faded orange paint, probably from hunters or some long-forgotten Forest Service project. The ground was damp from rain earlier in the week, and every now and then the wind would shift and bring with it the scent of rot from the thick underbrush. By the 3rd mile, Jess was flagging behind, sweating under her pack. "This better be worth it," she muttered, brushing away a cloud of gnats from her face. "It will be," Dylan said. At 19, he was the youngest of us, all wiry energy and nervous enthusiasm. He had a cheap GoPro strapped to his chest and kept stopping to film everything. Fungus on a rotting log, a deer track in the mud, shafts of light breaking through the canopy. He'd grown up on YouTube videos of bushcraft and survival channels, and thought this trip would be his chance to prove something. The further we hiked, the more the woods seemed to change. The silence grew deeper, more oppressive. No bird calls, no distant hum of insects, nothing but the sound of our boots and the occasional scrape of branches against our packs. At one point, I stopped to take a sip of water and realized I couldn't hear Dylan's GoPro beeping anymore or even Jess's quiet complaints. It was just still. "You feel that?" Wes asked quietly, coming up beside me. "Yeah," I said, trying to shake it off. "Probably just thick woods. Sound doesn't travel the same." We pushed on. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was dipping low, turning the treetops gold. The lake was smaller than I expected, almost perfectly round, its surface glassy and still. On the far side, a ridge rose sharply, black with pines. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Maybe it was how quiet it was, or how cold the air felt coming off the water, like stepping into the shadow of a cave. "This is it," Wes said, grinning as he dropped his pack. "Told you it'd be worth it." We set up camp near the shore, pitching 2 small tents on a patch of relatively flat ground. Dylan immediately started filming the setup, narrating like he was some backwoods survival expert. Jess wandered along the waterline, her arms folded tight across her chest, watching the reflection of the trees ripple with the light breeze. That first night, things felt normal enough. We built a small fire, cooked up some freeze-dried meals, and passed around a flask while Wes and Dylan argued about the best knots for hanging bear bags. When the darkness closed in, it was total, the kind of darkness you only get far from civilization. The sky was crowded with stars, sharp and bright, but the forest beyond the reach of the fire was just a wall of black. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Not the usual rustle of small animals. This was heavier, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The sound circled the camp, slow, almost dragging. I thought about unzipping the tent to look, but something in my gut told me not to. I lay there, every muscle tense, until it finally faded back into the trees. When morning came, I told myself it had just been a deer or maybe an elk passing through. I didn't mention it to anyone. We spent the next day exploring the area, fishing the lake, hiking the ridge to get a better view of the valley. Dylan filmed everything, his voice bright and excited, but when we played back one of his clips that evening by the fire, something strange caught our attention. In the background of a shot where he was panning across the lake, there was a shape, tall, pale, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't clear, just a flash between frames, but it made Jess go rigid. "Pause it," she said. Dylan frowned. "It's probably just a trick of the light, or me moving too fast." But even on pause, the shape was there. It almost looked like a figure, long arms, head tilted at an unnatural angle. That night, the noises came back, louder this time. Branches cracking, footsteps, something breathing just beyond the reach of the firelight. Wes and I sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, passing the flask back and forth, saying nothing. Every so often I'd think I saw movement between the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. Jess refused to leave the tent. By the third night, everything felt wrong. The forest was too quiet, the air too still. Even Dylan, who had been buzzing with excitement since we arrived, had gone quiet. He kept glancing toward the tree line like he expected something to step out at any moment. We talked about hiking out in the morning, maybe cutting the trip short. Jess was all for it. Wes didn't argue. That alone scared me more than anything. Wes never backed down from anything. That night, we didn't light a fire. We sat in the dark, whispering, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking to Jess shaking me, her eyes wide with panic. "Someone's outside," she whispered. I listened. At first, I heard nothing, then, there. Soft, wet footsteps circling the tent, a sound like breathing, too deep, too guttural to be human. And then the zipper of the other tent, the one Dylan was in, slowly, agonizingly started to open. I froze. Jess's nails dug into my arm. There was a noise, a scream, high and sharp, and then silence. When we finally found the courage to unzip the tent, Dylan was gone. His pack was still there, his boots, the GoPro lying in the dirt, the lens cracked clean through. We spent the next 2 hours yelling his name into the woods, our voices bouncing back at us like mockery. No response. No sign of him. Just that crushing silence and the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on all sides. When the sun finally rose, we grabbed what we could carry and started hiking out, leaving half our gear behind. The trail seemed different, less familiar, like the woods themselves had shifted while we slept. What should have been a 6-mile hike turned into an endless slog, the path twisting back on itself, landmarks vanishing. By afternoon, we were hopelessly lost. Jess was crying, Wes was swearing under his breath, and every so often I'd hear something behind us, footsteps that stopped when we stopped, branches snapping just out of sight. It followed us the entire day. When night fell, we didn't bother with tents. We huddled together under a tree, clutching the only flashlight we had left, waiting for morning. It never came. The darkness stretched on, unbroken, as if the sun had simply given up on us. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Hours. Days, it's hard to say. Hunger gnawed at us, thirst burned our throats, and still the footsteps circled closer and closer until they were right there, just beyond the faint beam of light. The last thing I remember clearly is Jess screaming, her voice ripping through the trees, and then nothing but the sound of breathing. I woke up alone. I don't know how I found my way out. I stumbled through the trees until the woods thinned and the sound of a highway cut through the silence. A trucker found me walking barefoot along the shoulder, clothes torn, lips cracked and bleeding. I told the rangers everything, but they never found Wes or Jess or Dylan. Not a trace. Sometimes late at night, I play back the footage from Dylan's GoPro, the last few minutes before the lens cracked. There's a shot of the lake, the water perfectly still, and just at the edge of the trees, that same pale shape watching. I've never been back to the bitter roots. I never will. Story the end. The first mistake was thinking 3 days in the Montana backcountry would be easy. It was supposed to be a simple trip, one last adventure before the cold rolled in, a way to shake off the stress of work and city noise. Adam had planned it for weeks, tracing trails on topo maps, watching YouTube videos about navigation, packing and repacking his gear until everything fit perfectly into his 60-liter pack. He told himself that his 2 friends, Jamie and Rick, were experienced enough to make up for what he lacked. By the time they parked at the trailhead on that Friday morning, The excitement had settled into a steady hum of confidence. The sky was a perfect blue, the kind of late summer clarity that made the pine-covered slopes look endless and alive. Their boots crunched over gravel and dirt as they set off, climbing steadily toward the ridgeline. Birds called in the distance, and a breeze moved through the treetops with a sound like rushing water. They talked and laughed at first, but as the hours passed and the incline steepened, the conversation faded, replaced by the sound of their breath and the distant rush of a creek somewhere far below. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing overlooking a narrow valley, the grass bent and dry beneath their boots. The plan was to follow the ridgeline for another few miles before making camp by a lake Adam had marked on the map. From up there, the wilderness stretched forever, rolling green ridges, sharp gray peaks, and the shimmering ribbon of water far off in the distance. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel small, almost insignificant. They reached the lake just before sunset. The water was black and still, reflecting the pink and orange sky like glass. Adam dropped his pack with a grunt and stretched, listening to the hum of insects and the soft rustle of the wind. Rick immediately started collecting firewood while Jamie filtered water from the lake, humming under his breath. Adam wandered along the shoreline, his boots sinking slightly in the damp earth, until he reached a patch of flattened grass near the trees. It looked wrong somehow, too neat, too deliberate. He crouched and ran a hand over the spot. The ground was cool, damp, and faintly disturbed, like someone had been there recently. He glanced back toward camp and almost called out to Rick and Jamie, but stopped himself. Maybe it was just another group of hikers. Still, a strange unease coiled low in his gut as he walked back. By the time the fire crackled and the sky turned from pink to deep indigo, the forest around them had gone quiet. Too quiet. Even the constant drone of insects had faded, replaced by a heavy stillness that made every snap of the firewood sound unnaturally loud. They sat around the flames, eating rehydrated meals and passing a flask of whiskey between them. Rick told stories about black bears and mountain lions, each tale more exaggerated than the last, while Jamie laughed and shook his head. But Adam kept glancing toward the tree line, his stomach tight. The woods felt different now, denser, watching. When it was time to sleep, they stashed their food and zipped themselves into their tents. Adam lay awake for a long time, listening to the faint creak of branches and the occasional splash from the lake. At some point, exhaustion pulled him under. The sound woke him sometime after midnight. At first, he thought it was wind, just a gust slipping through the trees. But then it came again, closer this time, a steady crunch of footsteps in the dry underbrush. Not a bear, not an elk, something deliberate. Adam held his breath and strained to listen. The footsteps circled the camp, slow and measured, pausing every few seconds as though whatever it was listening too. His heart pounded so loud he was sure it could hear. Then, silence. For a long minute, the only sound was his own shallow breathing. Then, from somewhere just beyond the tents, a soft, drawn-out whistle. Adam froze. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was human. He shot a glance at the other tent but didn't see any movement. Either Rick and Jamie were asleep or they were just as frozen as he was. The whistle came again, low and eerie, and then the sound of footsteps retreating into the trees. Adam stayed awake until dawn, clutching the small hatchet he'd packed, every muscle in his body coiled tight. When the sun finally bled through the trees, painting the lake in pale light, he unzipped his tent and stumbled outside. Rick was already up, pale and bleary-eyed, packing his gear in tight, jerky movements. "Did you hear that?" Adam asked, his voice low. Rick hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." "What was it?" Jamie's voice came from behind, sharp with unease. Neither of them answered. They broke camp quickly, skipping breakfast and setting off along the narrow trail that hugged the ridge. The morning was bright and clear, but the forest felt darker somehow, the trees taller and the shadows deeper. Adam kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. But the trail behind them remained empty, winding back into the trees. By midday, they'd covered nearly 10 miles, but the trail was less distinct now, overgrown in places, and the map didn't match the terrain. At one point, they stopped to check their bearings, but the compass needle spun oddly, twitching like it couldn't find north. "This isn't right," Jamie muttered, frowning at the topo lines. "We should have hit the creek by now." We probably missed the turnoff, Rick said, though his voice lacked conviction. Let's keep moving. We'll find it. But the trail narrowed further, the trees crowding in so tightly they had to push through branches that snagged their packs and scraped their arms. By the time the sun began to sink, a thin orange line bleeding through the trees, they realized they were lost. They made camp in a small hollow beneath an overhanging rock face. No fire this time. The air was thick and still, carrying a faint, metallic tang that made Adam's stomach churn. They ate in silence, the unease between them as palpable as the growing darkness. That night, the footsteps came again, closer. Adam's pulse roared in his ears as he gripped his hatchet. Rick hissed for silence from his tent, and Jamie whispered a panicked prayer. The footsteps circled the camp slowly, methodically, crunching over dry leaves, then stopping. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, a void that pressed in on them from all sides. Then came the whistle, low, drawn out, mocking. Adam's breath hitched. He forced himself to look out through the thin mesh of the tent. At first he saw nothing, just the shifting shadows of the trees under the faint light of the moon. Then movement. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall, thin, motionless. His mouth went dry. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, its head tilted slightly as though it was studying the camp. Adam blinked, and it was gone. They didn't sleep. By morning, they packed and hiked without speaking. Every sound amplified. The snap of twigs underfoot, the rustle of unseen animals, the distant call of crows that sounded almost like laughter. They tried to follow the sun, moving downhill in hopes of finding the creek, but the forest seemed to shift around them, trails vanishing and reappearing in ways that made no sense. By late afternoon, Jamie collapsed by a fallen log, his face gray and his hands shaking. "We're not getting out," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It doesn't want us to." Rick started to argue, but stopped when they heard it again. The whistle, closer now. Adam's skin crawled as he turned, scanning the dense trees. He saw nothing, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. That night, they didn't bother with tents. They sat together by the cold ashes of an unlit fire, backs pressed to each other, weapons clutched in shaking hands. The forest was alive with sound, branches creaking, leaves rustling, soft, deliberate footsteps circling just beyond the shadows. At some point, Jamie started to cry. Rick whispered at him to shut up, but his own voice trembled. Then, from the darkness, a voice. Soft, calm, almost human. "Come here." Adam's blood ran cold. It sounded like Luis, the friend who disappeared on a trip last year in a nearby stretch of forest. But that was impossible. The voice came again, closer, almost coaxing. "Come here. It's safe." Jamie stood. Before Adam could grab him, he was gone, vanishing into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. His scream came seconds later, high, sharp, and then abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was absolute. Adam and Rick didn't speak, didn't move. They just sat there trembling until the first light of dawn bled through the trees. When Adam finally turned, Rick was gone. The only sound was the whistle, low and mocking, drifting through the trees. Adam ran. Branches tore at his face and arms. Roots caught his boots, but he didn't stop until his lungs burned and his legs buckled. He collapsed by the edge of a shallow creek, the water cold and sharp against his shaking hands. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his ragged breathing and the rush of water. Then he heard it again, the whistle, closer, and then a voice. Soft, calm, almost human. "Come here, it's the end."